Hey class, I've got to be honest. This this class is sometimes I feel like it's all of the things that depress me. So it took me a while to get into um, this material. I have to update it every time I teach it, of course. You'll see it. Hopefully, it won't depress you. If it does, let's talk about it. So, one when we're talking about climate change, one thing I like to start off the discussion with is just trying to get clear on what kind of an issue we're even talking about. It's not obvious to me that everybody knows what there is, or even if there's a single issue that climate change is about. When we do polling on this is from 2 years ago. They asked several hundred Americans, and the vast majority thought that it was an environmental issue. Only about 1 in 8 maybe said that it was a religious issue. About 2 in 5 said it was a moral issue. 3 in 5 said it was a health, political, or economic issue. Um, I mean, I think it's all of these in some sense, depending on what you're paying attention to. But let's take some of these in turn. And starting alphabetically, perhaps. So, we live on this earth. There are 7 billion people on it. A lot of them are food insecure. Many of them are children, maybe of them are living in countries with poor infrastructure. 1 in 9 people on the planet go hungry every day. It's about 11%. And it tends to focus on a lot of Africa, Oceania, Southern Asia. It's it's a real issue, and it's been an issue for a long time. Climate exacerbates it as an issue. When you think about climate, I like to think about the line adage of weather is what climate is what you expect. So weather is what's happening tomorrow. Climate is what happens on average this time of year. And by that definition, the climate has changed, and it will continue to change. In fact, arguably, the way to think about climate change is not that the climate will change to something else. It's that we'll never live in a period of stable climate again until we start doing something very drastic. It will continue to be changing in a way that will leave people that are not able to adapt in really tough environments. And a lot of people have trouble adapting in different places based on local conditions. Um, there's a degree of inter and intra-dependence all over the world. Here I'm showing Africa. It is the locus of a lot of food insecurity. If the climate changes, it can cause droughts. Basically, droughts and floods are two sides of the same coin, water not being where it should be. And if water is not where it should be, the soil begins to erode, which might increase energy costs, which might affect amount of water in dams and rivers and aquifers, storage. There might be acidification, even if that we'll spend much more time on acidification. It's the part of climate change that truly terrifies me. Just increased risk of toxicity, increased reliance on international goodwill when your particular nation suffers ill effects. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about one of those particular scenarios and how turns it into not just a food security issue, not just an agricultural issue that affects some people, but an international foreign policy issue and a risk of warfare issue. Our best expectation is that as grain yields decrease by about 10% global average surface temperature, so every 2 degrees Fahrenheit, it's about 10% decrease. The current goals are to try to keep the increase of surface temperature on this planet to about 2 degrees centigrade, which is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. That is getting harder and harder to think that we'll actually reach. We're already at 1 degree centigrade, Celsius, about 1.8 of Fahrenheit, of an increase since the 20th century average. So limiting it to 2 seems difficult, but once we get past that, you get to some very drastic scenarios. And we'll talk about other aspects of what makes those so drastic. In this, I just want to focus on the fact that there'd be a decrease there's an expected decrease in food supply, something like 20 to 30% likely. And yet we expect populations to increase. So we expect more work for more people, but the land producing less results, meaning that we would have to increase either the productivity of the land or our diets to rely less on these land-hungry meat as opposed to vegetables or whatnot. We'd have to do something, and pretty drastic by about 60%. So in order to not make much more of the planet go hungry and starve, we must address this. Interestingly, this is one of those places where we get confluence between economic, social, and environmental factors. One thing I'll harp on again and again in this class is that when situations are tough, when times are tough, deep divisions, underlying inequalities manifest, and the societies tend to break down along the traditional divisions within those societies. So 70% of the world's poor live in rural areas, and there's going to be widespread food insecurity, global food. They're going to be very, very reliant on either economic activity or social help, right? There's going to be some heavy reliance on both national and international governments as this happens. For now, I'll just leave it there. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about how that's expected to cause a huge spillover, and why it's desirable for us to care about it now. Because if your neighbor is starving, it's a matter of time before they have to resort to dangerous behavior. But we'll get to that. So farmers relying on small areas, in rural areas, hoping that their crops produce the yields that they need. And if the climate changes, you can have entire crops collapse and entire nations collapse. The thing about the food issue with climate change, and you're going to see this in all of these issues, we actually already know how to solve the problem. This isn't impossible. We know how to do it. And we've been doing it in various ways for nearly a century. So Fritz Haber, early on in the class, develops the Haber-Bosch process, which allows for nitrogen fixation, which allows for us to grow more crops on land, better land. We've developed many, many more techniques since then. We've developed increased irrigation. We've been able to genetically modify crops. We've figured out which crops yield the best results in which orders and ratios. Fertilizers, information is out there, right? Like there's all sorts of ways of improving food productivity, and we know how to do it. We have done it. The United States, its productivity 100 years ago was a fraction of what it is now. Years ago, most of you would be children of farmers or farmers yourselves. Now, very few of you actually even know a farmer. And these techniques have spread to other parts of the world. We've been able to use these techniques and help develop them in other parts of the world. This was called the Green Revolution. There's parts of Africa that are still working on developing. A lot of this is a coordination issue, technological or scientific issue. And you're going to see that again and again in this entire class. Sometimes the science and the technology isn't the problem. It's getting to work for you. Okay. So maybe climate change is a food and food security issue. That if there's not enough water or there's too much water, crops fail. People that are in food insecure places are more likely to starve, and all that follows from that. So a lot of people also said that it was an economic issue. So we'll talk about that right now, and then we'll come back to it in a later lecture. When you look at billion-dollar disasters, these are disasters that, adjusted for inflation, caused $1 billion of damage or more in the United States. The past 5 years have been the 5 worst years of billion-dollar disasters. In fact, when you look over decades, you compare the amount of billion-dollar disasters and the amount that we have spent mitigating these disasters, it's dwarfed, right? So a generation ago, your parents, there was a risk that they would be in a fire or in a hurricane or some other natural disaster, flood, drought. But now it's much, much more likely. And in fact, you see it in the air quality around you, right? As you breathe in the smoke outside, know that you're breathing in somebody's home. Somebody's prized possessions have been destroyed. And likely those people will have a permanent, lifelong economic consequence. They might drop several rungs on the economic ladder. Not to mention people dying and health effects from breathing in all of these dangerous chemicals. So there's economic costs, and so far this is only updated first half of the year. About, I don't know, close to $12 billion plus disasters in the United States. Keep in mind, this isn't counting the wildfires, which we'll spend quite a bit of time in the next lecture talking about. So, climate change might be an environmental issue, might be a scientific issue, might be an agricultural issue. There's a sense in which it's an economic issue as well, in that if you are in one of these areas that has suffered more damage because predominantly climate change, although increased development is also to blame, right? There's more houses to burn down, so there's more people whose houses can burn down. But even adjusting for that, that doesn't explain all of the observed damage. Various parts of the country are susceptible to various issues. I'll talk about heat and wildfires in the next video. Right now, I kind of want to talk about hurricanes. Hurricanes will lead me to another set of issues that climate change might be. If climate change is a severe weather issue, very few severe weather events are more flashy than hurricanes. Right now, we are on pace to break a record for having the most hurricanes. We are past the alphabet. Usually we have 21 named storms. We try to go through most of the letters of the alphabet. And we have this cycle that repeats every 6 years of names. And if they're too bad, we retire those names permanently. 2020, we are now in Hurricane Delta, which is forming and actually looks pretty terrible. So we ran out of the names in the alphabet and had to go alpha, beta, gamma, delta. It's not just number of hurricanes. The actual severity of the hurricanes increased. Hurricane Andrew, people in Florida used to tell stories about people who were permanently traumatized because this was a Category 5 storm that hit Florida, and a lot of people suffered. Irma in 2017, also a Category 5 storm. Category 5 is as high as it gets. People are thinking we need to be adding new categories to storms in order to differentiate, because even though Hurricane Andrew was the one of the biggest, most damaging hurricanes, when you put it to scale next to Irma or some of the hurricanes that we get now, it's just not comparable at all. There's a video that I'm going to put in the description that I want you to check out about what it's like to live through hurricanes. So the hurricanes, there's more of them, which you would expect, right? As the surface of the water gets warmer, temperature, according to our basic physics, is average molecular motion. If there's more motion, there's more energy. If there's more energy, as you get storms, they get more energetic. They're stronger, they're bigger. So it's easier to move across warmer water. And the slightest bit of warming can have huge consequences, devastating consequences, billion-dollar consequences. Some storms can flood the fourth most populous city in the United States. People that escaped Katrina in 2005 went to Houston and other parts of Texas and settled some of the poorer neighborhoods, only to find those again were hit pretty drastically just a decade later. We find this more and more, right? People have to find shelter in stadiums because their houses are unlivable now. When we get to the health section of this class, when we talk about COVID-19, we talk about its intersection with other existing damage and risk, like flu season and hurricane season, where you might have to send a bunch of people somewhere to recover. But they can't actually socially distance in those areas, we might have other problems. I mean, it'd be great if they had other homes to go to, or if they got relief from their government. Right. So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, they got very little, and in fact, a lot of it was squandered. They were blamed for it and ignored. And in fact, it tends to happen in these circumstances when we have severe weather. If you have another home to go to, or friends and family to stay with, or live in Beverly Hills, and the politicians care about you, you're likely to find relief. If, on the other hand, you're close to destitution, that's just where you'll be left. Again, disasters exacerbate inequalities. They exacerbate problems. Puerto Rico is not a state. It is a territory colony of the United States. And so they weren't able to get some of the relief that a state like Florida would have gotten or has gotten. That said, California is a state, and it's been pretty widely ignored this past fire season. We'll talk about that in the next video. It's led some people to coin the term environmental racism. This is the view that sometimes there is racial discrimination in environmental enforcement and regulations and remedies. Flint still is not right. Water in Flint is still not recommended to drink. It's been poisoned for several years now, 4 years. Lead is a neurotoxin. We talked about lead already. And the reason it happened was because the governor wanted to save a couple of $100 on pipe maintenance, but it hasn't been addressed. And again, if this happened in Wall Street or in, downtown, any central area where there's like Malibu, right? This would be addressed. The fact is, it's not, and it probably won't be. You can look at a correlation between super fun sites, between toxic areas where we locate toxic chemical facilities, toxic release inventory, and superimpose it onto areas where people of color live. And it's almost a perfect match. Jesus. And I mean, this is a systemic problem, right? Like I'm not claiming people make active decisions to poison Black and brown people, but because like Black and brown and poor and rural people don't have political power, they can't address these issues. They can't redress their grievances. There's nobody that will listen. So there's a lot of heavy stuff here. And I covered lots of topics, and I'm going to cover a lot more. Climate change is, it's like a construction on Virginia Street. It affects your daily life in ways you didn't expect. It's like if your home was being remodeled without your consent, and now you have to adjust to where your bedroom is. It's an issue, and typically the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The people that are best able to deal with it, and everybody else. I'm going to quickly get into health issues, because health issues are going to stay with us through the rest of this. We've already talked about some health issues. Starvation, being hit by a hurricane can't be healthy. But as climate change continues, there's a positive feedback loop, which is terrible. Go outside and breathe right now, and you'll see that there's increased pollutions. In some parts of the world, there's increased allergens. Disease vectors change their habitat. Water quality, water and food quality, environmental degradation, and severe weather and heat, all of these feed into each other in a terrible way. You can have direct impacts. The stuff we talked about: fires, heat waves, floods, hurricanes. Or you can have other changes that, when added to the traditional divisions and the traditional demographic issues in the region. And I say this, know that if you were living in a different country, the divisions would be different, right? Like racial, class, regional differences change depending on your society, right? But nevertheless, they factor into everything and yield disparate health impact. We have lots of evidence for this. And in fact, maybe I'll just stop here, because the evidence for it is going to lead us into a broader discussion of the evidence for climate change and just all of the consequences that we know have. And if you read the book, you'll see how severe